Hey folks, my name is Adam Biggs and I teach African American Studies and U.S. History at the university. The video that you guys are going to watch is a TED Talk by Keeanga Yamahtta Taylor, and she is faculty at Princeton University. And she's talking about the unrest that and the protests that emerged after the death of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. And that was in 2015. I think her talk is actually recorded in 2016. But the reason I wanted you guys to take a look at it is because she is talking about essentially how systemic racism functions within the law enforcement system and how it functions within policing in American society. And I want to draw a distinction between structural racism or institutional racism or systemic forms of racism and the way we often talk about racism. Like a lot of times when we talk about racism, people are thinking about interpersonal interactions, right? Something that was said or an attitude held by somebody that was insulting or discriminatory. But when we talk about institutional forms of discrimination, what we are talking about is things that really tend to have a larger impact on shaping the outcome and well-being of human lives, right? The outcome and well-being of Black lives. So we're talking about forms and institutions like the healthcare system, like the legal justice system. We're talking about things like the economy. We're talking about things like education even. We can talk about things like our political system. And to the extent that these institutions have ingrained within them practices and policies that marginalize Black communities, they also have a disproportionate and direct impact on Black lives and their well-being. If we look at just a couple basic numbers, when we talk about disparities in wealth, for example, the median white family has about 13 times the wealth of the average Black family. And I think that number is in the range of something like 130,000 versus about 10,000. But we can also talk about disparities in things like, for example, healthcare outcomes. I mean, there's no clearer example of how Black Americans suffer disproportionately from with regard to health than the current pandemic, right? We see Black Americans in terms of morbidity and mortality rates. Black Americans are more likely, by I think almost 2 to 1, than white Americans are to contract the disease and actually die from it, right? So in places, when we talk about something like law enforcement, the disparities are also equally as great. We see Black Americans make up about 13% of the national population, but they comprise 40% of our federal prison population. In South Carolina, I think Black Americans make up about 28, 29, 30% of South Carolina's population, but they're 60%, maybe a little bit more than that, of South Carolina's prison population. And I think when we look at these disparities, sometimes it's very kind of convenient for us to think, well, these are just sort of things that happen, right? This is just kind of the norm. It's just the way things are. But in many ways, the mistake of institutional racism is that it creates a sense that nobody in particular is accountable for what's happening here, right? And I think that's part of why it's so important to talk about it, because you don't have to be, it doesn't matter if you're a good person or a bad person. It doesn't matter if you have bigoted views. It doesn't matter if you are willingly or intentionally taking part in these institutions. In many regards, we remain complicit, right, when we don't critique them, right, when we're unaware of our involvement in them. And we can be complicit even when we are aware of our involvement in them. But we need to understand how they work. We need to understand how they function, because they have such a disproportionate impact on the lives and well-beings of so many communities. And so that's part of what I want you guys to think about, right? Like, we are accountable even for those things which we may not see ourselves as being intimately involved with, right? We are accountable for things that we may not see ourselves as having started or initiated, right? Or intentionally sort of taken part in. Even those things we are complicit in, those are also things that we should be held accountable for. So as you guys are watching this video, I hope you get something real meaningful from it. I want you to kind of think about these issues. I think it speaks very well really toward a lot of the unrest and a lot of the current historical moment that we're experiencing. So, yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it, and see you in the fall.